You know him as Ángel Batista on Dexter, Calm Under Pressure, Corazón on the sleeve, a cop who feels real. That realism wasn't invented on set. David Zayas was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico on August 15, 1962, raised in the Bronx and shaped by service. First in the United States Air Force, then nearly 15 years with the NYPD. When he steps into a badge on screen, he's drawing from life, la calle, discipline, empathy. But behind the roles is a family story. He is the son of Hugo Zayas and Blanca Rivera, part of a Boricua journey from La Isla to New York that forged character long before the cameras. And alongside his wife, fellow Boricua actor Liza Colon, he's turned that lived experience into a career that spans gritty HBO's Oz to the cultural phenomenon of Dexter. Today, we follow the paper trail, names, places, and generations to see how lineage and life shape the artist. From Ponceño roots to a Bronx upbringing, from service to stardom, esta es la historia. I am Dyron Castro Torres, the genealogist, and this is From Dexter to Destiny, the genealogy of David Zayas. April 1st, 1940, the mountains of Ajuntas. This is the U.S. Census for Puerto Rico. In one household, I find the names of actor David Zayas' paternal line. Thomas Zayas Ramos, head of household, his wife, Jacinta Maldonado, and their son, Hugo Zayas Maldonado, the boy who would become David's father. The form does what good records do. It fixes a family in time and place. All three are recorded as born in Puerto Rico, living here in Ajuntas in 1935, and still here in 1940, which tells me I'm looking at a rooted mountain family rather than recent migrants. In the employment columns, Thomas appears as a road worker, the Puerto Rico Department of the Interior, New Deal work that kept many households afloat through the tail end of the Great Depression. That single line turns a name into a life, steady labor, public works, resilience. For our genealogy, this page locks in Hugo's parents' full surnames and ties the Zayas Ramos branch to Ajuntas, pointing me straight towards the parish registers, the civil records for marriages, baptisms, and earlier censuses in this municipality. It also places the family in a specific economic moment, which helps explain later moves and opportunities we'll see down the tree. There's one small box on this page that will matter later, their race. It's considered blanco or white, a quiet detail I'm setting aside for now, but it hints that the Zayas story is more layered than it first appeared. And that's where I find the next clue. New York, 1950. The U.S. Census catches the Zayas family far from the coffee slopes of Ajuntas. On this sheet, Thomas Zayas Ramos is listed as head of household in the Bronx, working as a paint mixer in a paint factory. His wife, Jacinta Maldonado, is recorded as a cutter in a woman's undergarment factory, another piece of the garment industry that pulled thousands of Boricua families into post-war New York. And there, in the same household, is their son, Hugo Zayas, already in New York years before David's birth. That one entry changes the timeline. Hugo wasn't a latecomer into the city. He migrated early, then must have traveled back to Puerto Rico before David was born, returning later to raise his family in the Bronx. For our genealogy, this page does more than place names on a line. It maps a migration arc, rural Ajuntas to industrial New York, labor in factories, and the social networks that set the stage for our next generation. It explains how David would grow up with the New York rhythm already in his blood, even though his story begins in Ponce. To see what pushed the family north and what held them together, I need to step back one more generation. And that's when the trail leads me to Thomas Zayas himself. I turn the page to a civil birth entry from Ajuntas dated January 27, 1907. In careful ink, it names the child Tomas Aquino Zayas Ramos, the same Thomas who would later appear in New York as a paint mixer and the head of the Zayas household. The registrar spells out his lineage with precision. Son of Luis Zayas Oliveira and Maria Tomasa Ramos Ortiz. Paternal grandson of Manuel Encarnacion Zayas and Juana Evangelista Oliveira. Maternal grandson of Jose Ramon Ramos and Ramona Ortiz. The clerk records him as Blanco, a reminder that racial labels in Puerto Rican records can be fluid, administrative, and deeply tied to a place, time, and opportunity. For genealogy, this single page is gold. It locks in 4 grandparents, confirms compound surnames we need to chase in earlier parish books, and anchors the family in ajuntas at the turn of the 20th century. With these names, I can pivot to baptisms, marriages, and notarial files to test connections, track migrations, and watch how the family's social standing is described across decades. And that's where I find the next clue. This is the civil death certificate for Thomas Aquino Zayas Ramos, the same Thomas we just followed from ajuntas to the Bronx and back again. This record, issued by Puerto Rico's Department of Health in 1986, closes his chapter with the details a genealogist needs to lock a line in place. He is named as husband of Jacinta Maldonado and the son of Luis Zayas and Tomasa Ramos. It confirms what the birth entry told us decades earlier and stitches his life into a single thread. From a boy recorded in ajuntas in 1907 to a patriarch whose family story reaches New York and ultimately David Zayas. Death certificates are more than a date, they're a checksum for a tree. Names, places, occupations, and informants converge here to prove identity and relationships. With Tomas, we now have both ends of the rope, birth and death, so every record we add to them strengthens the case. Now that we have Tomas's story securely documented, the trail points to the man who set this branch in motion, and that's when I turn to his father, Luis Zayas Oliveira. I open the parish book for ajuntas, and there he is, Luis Zayas Oliveira, baptized November 7, 1857. The priest writes him as the son of Encarnacion Zayas and Juana Oliveira. Then, the entry widens the circle. Paternal grandparent Monserrate Zayas, maternal grandparent Isabel Oliveira. No grandfathers are mentioned, which means his parents were both born outside of marriage. 4 names, 2 lines, and suddenly the Zayas Oliveira branch takes shape half a century before Tomas's birth. Under Luis's name sits a single letter that changes how we read this family, P. In these records, that stands for Pardo, a free person of color, typically the generational mix of Spaniard, Taino, and African that defined so many Boricua lineages in the 19th century. For context, parish books of this era used a small vocabulary of racial terms with big social consequences. Blanco, classified as white or Spanish, Indio, indigenous Taino origin, Negro, of African descent, Mestizo, Spanish plus indigenous, Mulatto, Spanish plus African, Pardo, Libre de color, a mixed ancestry commonly spanning Spanish, African, and indigenous lines. These labels were administrative, imperfect, and could shift across time and document type. But when they appear, they're genealogical clues to community, mobility, and how a family navigated colonial society. This one baptism tells me where to dig next. Confirmations, marriages, and padrinos for Encarnacion Zayas, Juana Oliveira, Monserrate Zayas, and Isabel Oliveira, the network that framed the Zayas identity long before New York entered the story. And that's where I find the next clue. I turn to an acta de defunción from ajuntas, dated February 24th, 1926. It records the passing of Luis Zayas Oliveira, the man whose baptism marked him as Pardo in 1857, but whose civil death entry now classifies him as Blanco. 1 life, 2 labels. In Puerto Rico, that shift wasn't unusual. Race in the records can move with the time, community, and circumstance. The certificate fixes Luis into his family, son of Manuel Encarnación Zayas and Juana Evangelista Olivera, husband of Maria Tomasa Ramos, and father to a household of children, including Tomas Zayas Ramos, the grandfather of actor David Zayas. It gives us residents in adjuntas, names of offsprings that flesh out the sibling network, and the civil confirmation that ties this branch together across church and state records. For our tree, this document does two crucial things. It corroborates relationships established in the baptismal books, and it shows how the Zayas family navigated social categories across decades. With Luis anchored, the trail points naturally to the generation before him, the people who first stamped Zayas into the mountain parish. And that's when I turned the page to Manuel Encarnación Zayas. I opened the parish book of Nuestra Señora de Rosario Yauco, and the ink jumps off the page. Manuel. The priest writes that on April 8, 1829, he baptized the child and gave him the name Manuel, hijo natural of Monserrate Zayas of this parish. No father is named. For a genealogist, that phrase, hijo natural, is crucial. It tells me that Manuel entered the world outside of a sacramental marriage, and that the surname Zayas flowed through his mother, a clue that will shape every search that follows. Then, the record delivers a surprise in the margins of history. The godparents are Francisco Antonio Pola and Monserrate Irizarry. If you've watched my earlier videos, those names might ring loud. They are the second great-grandparents of actor Jimmy Smits. And for me, they are my own fifth great-grandparents. One baptism, three families, a network that stitched the 19th century Yauco together and still echoes through Puerto Rican culture today. This single entry anchors Manuel Encarnación Zayas, the grandfather of Luis Zayas Olivera, and it gives us a place, date, and kin. From here, padrinos, witnesses, and adjoining entries will help map Monserrate Zayas' circle and the neighbors who stood with her. And that's when I found the next clue. I'm back in Adjuntas, reading the Civil Death Act of Manuel Encarnación Zayas, dated September 29, 1904. The clerk notes him as a widower, dying in his own residence, and then writes the line that locks our chain in place. Manuel is the hijo natural of Monserrate Zayas, the same fact we saw in his 1829 baptism in Yauco. Two records, 75 years apart, saying the same thing. Even better for our tree, the certificate lists his children, and there, among them, is Luis Zayas Olivera, the father of Tomas, the grandfather of David Zayas. On these pages, we confirm Manuel's status, connect him forward to the 1926 death of Luis, and establish a sibling set that will guide searches through parish marriages, padrinos, and notarial files. This is how a family hardens into evidence: baptism, death act, descendants' names on ink. To explain the surname's path and the community that stood behind it, I need to follow the woman who anchors this line, and that's when I turn to Monserrate Zayas. Here, we have a marriage entry from Yauco, dated November 11, 1840. It records the union of Juan Monserrate, described here in text as liberto, a man formerly enslaved and freed, and Monserrate Zayas, hija natural of Juana Zayas. Three names, two status words, and an entire world opens up. This line lands 11 years after another document we've just seen, the 1829 baptism of Manuel Encarnación Zayas, recorded as hijo natural of Monserrate Zayas with no father named. The gap matters. It tells me Monserrate Zayas was already a mother when she married Juan Monserrate in 1840. Is Juan the biological father of Encarnación? The record does not say so, and I won't infer a father the book doesn't name, but the context makes it possible. Encarnación is identified later as Pardo Libre, and Juan is explicitly Liberto. Couples sometimes formalize families after freedom or better circumstances, and parish books often left fathers blank in earlier years only to bring the household under the church later. We keep the hypothesis open, not as fact, until another record proves or disproves it. For our genealogy, this marriage is powerful evidence. It anchors Monserrate Zayas to her mother, Juana, places her inside of Jauco's Free People of Color community, and documents a tie to a man who had crossed the line from bondage to liberty. That's social history baked into a sacramental page, and it helps explain how the Zayas surname flowed down to Manuel Encarnacion, then to Luis Zayas Oliveira, then to Tomas, and finally to Hugo, David's father. I'll keep digging for a paper that names Encarnacion's father outright, whether a marriage dispensation, confirmation, notarial act, even later death records sometimes tell on the past. But then, I found the next clue. We are looking at the death entry for Monserrate Zayas, dated May 31st, 1852. It places her in Guayanilla, the town that sits between Jauco and Ajuntas, which neatly explains how our Zayas line moved across those parishes. The priest identifies her as the hija natural of Juana and the wife of Juan Monserrate, who appears in this record to be named Rodriguez. That surname shift is typical in the mid-19th century records. Enslaved and freed people, or those known primarily by given names, often stabilized their surnames later in life across documents. The entry notes that she died around 70 years of age and that she received the last sacraments, details that anchor her not only to a place, but to a community. Genealogically, this record ties up the thread we pulled from Jauco. Monserrate Zayas, the mother who gave Manuel Encarnacion Zayas his surname, dies in Guayanilla, firmly linking the triangle of towns that shaped the family before we climbed into Ajuntas, and generations later into New York. It also confirms the household we suspected, Monserrate with Juan Monserrate Rodriguez, though the books never name him as father of Encarnacion explicitly. And that's where the paper trail closes, for now, on the Zayas side. To understand the other half of David's story, I turn to his mother, Blanca Rivera, and that's where I find the next clue. Manatee, Puerto Rico, 1950. We are looking at a U.S. Census sheet that freezes a household in a single April day, and right in the middle is Blanca Rivera Cintrón, the woman who will become David Zayas' mother. The head of household is Ismael Nieto Cartwright, listed as married to Blanca's mother, Emilia Cintrón Camacho. This form uses the period term colored for Ismael, language of this time. But what matters for our tree is the pattern of surnames. Every child is recorded as Rivera Cintrón, not Nieto Cintrón. This tells me Ismael is the stepfather, not the biological Rivera that we're hunting. Then, another name seals the maternal line, Dolores Camacho, Emilia's mother, living under the same roof. 3 generations, Dolores, Emilia, Blanca. The first 2 born in Utuado, the latter in Arecibo. This one page confirms relationships, places the family in post-war Puerto Rico, and gives me a clue I need to pursue Blanca's father, the missing Rivera. To find him, I follow the sibling trail. One sister's records spell out what the census only implies. And that's when I turn to Carmen Rivera Cintrón to uncover the Rivera father. Santurce, Puerto Rico, January 30th, 1960. The marriage book finally names the father I'd been chasing. Carmen Dolores Rivera marries, born in Arecibo, and recorded as the legitimate daughter of Juan Rivera and Emilia Cintrón. That line confirms the Rivera parent for Blanca's sibling set we saw in Manatee, and shifts our focus from inference to fact. Place, parish, and parents. Everything we need to anchor the maternal side. And now, let's turn to Emilia Cintrón. The 1920 U.S. Census of Puerto Rico puts the Cintrón Camacho household in sharp focus. At the top is Elias Cintrón Cortez, head of the family, and beside him is his wife Dolores Camacho Rivera, a woman I've also recorded as Salvadora in other records. Among their children is Emilia Cintrón Camacho, the same Emilia who later appears in Manatí as the mother of Blanca Rivera Cintrón. For our tree, this page locks Emilia to both parents and anchors the family in place and time, exactly what we need to push the Cintrón branch backwards into parish books and civil registers. And that's when I follow Elias Cintrón Cortez to uncover the next clue. Utuado, February 9, 1907. This is the civil record that files a Protestant marriage certificate, a detail that already sets this family apart in early 1900s Puerto Rico. It names the groom Elias Cintrón Cortez, son of José Cintrón and Lorenza Cortez, and the bride Salvadora or Dolores Camacho Rivera, daughter of Gregorio Camacho and Rufina Rivera. One page pulls the Cintrón and Camacho lines into focus and explains the household we later saw in the 1920 census. This is the union that produced Emilia Cintrón Camacho, mother of Blanca Rivera Cintrón and the grandmother of David Zayas. Genealogically, this is a keystone. It fixes parents on both sides, locks us to Utuado, and shows the family's religious footprint, which brings us to our next clue. Utuado, Puerto Rico, September 9th, 1898. A death act written as Puerto Rico was still catching its breath. The Spanish-American War had paused less than a month earlier with the August 12th armistice, and yet the civil registry kept moving, line by line. Here, the clerk records the passing of Juan José Cintrón Velez, husband of Lorenza Cortez, and legitimate son of José María Cintrón Goytia and Juana Velez Irizarry. For our tree, this page is a keystone. It confirms Elias Cintrón's lineage through Lorenza Cortez's spouse, and names the generation above, Cintrón Goytia, a double surname that, in Utuado, points to a single extended family. That uniqueness is a lighthouse. It lets me track this branch across baptisms, marriages, and notarial records without confusing it with other Cintrón lines. The war was changing the island, but this one record anchors our family into place, time, and kin. Exactly what we need to follow the name that stands out. And that's when I turn to the Cintrón Goytia line. This is a fragment of a death act dated November 18, 1893 for Dominga Cintrón Goytia, and it gives me exactly what I needed. In the priest's hand, Dominga is named the daughter of Tomas Cintrón and Blasina Goytia. That one line confirms the parents behind the Cintrón Goytia double surname and ties Dominga to her brother José María Cintrón Goytia, the same ancestor we've been tracking. For our tree, this fixes the sibling set and, more importantly, spotlights the maternal branch we need to follow next, Blasina Goytia, the key to where this distinctive surname enters the family. And that's when I turn to Blasina Goytia to find the next clue. I pushed the trail back to the 18th century with a published transcription of Utuado's Book 1 of Baptisms, transcribed by David Enrique Cuesta Camacho and published by the Puerto Rican Genealogical Society. Two entries unlock the line. First, February 16, 1768, Blasina Goytia was baptized and is the legitimate daughter of Don Tomas de Goytia and Doña Clara de Quiñones, names that place her inside Utuado's elite kin network. Then, further back, August 15, 1746, Clara Quiñones herself baptized and is the legitimate daughter of Alférez Don José de Quiñones and Doña María de Gracia de Quiñones. The rank of Alférez plus the Don Doña status situates this branch inside Utuado's military civic elites, and the dates line up. Clara in 1746 becomes Blasina's mother in 1768. And that's when I went looking for Alférez Don José de Quiñones and Doña Maria de Gracia de Quiñones, origins, to push this line even further. Arecibo, Puerto Rico, February 19th, 1738. In the parish book, the ink names two branches of the same house. Don José de Quiñones, legitimate son of Capitán Juan Isidro Martín de Quiñones, and Doña Micaela de Mirabal, marries Doña Maria de Gracia Quiñones, legitimate daughter of Alférez Miguel Martín de Quiñones and Doña Francesca Ortiz de la Renta. Alférez is a military rank that means ensign, the lowest commissioned officer in the Spanish colonial militia. Capitán speaks for itself. Rank, titles, and surnames tell me that this was a union inside the military civic elite. There's a wrinkle. This marriage should have carried a consanguinity dispensation of the third degree, a formal note the church required when close kin married. The wedded pair are both great-grandchildren of Capitán Andrés Martín de Quiñones and his wife Ana de Sana Borrero. The relationship is clear in the surnames and lines, but the clerk left off the dispensation of this copy. Even in omission, the page whispers how tightly knit these families were. Then the record gives me a personal jolt. Among the witnesses is Juan Blas de Matos, my ninth great-grandfather, standing in the church as the Quiñones and Mirabal bloodlines joined. One page, and the story threads together: military rank, kinship, and a witness from my own lineage. To understand how this union connects to our story, I follow the bridegroom's mother, Doña Micaela de Mirabal, legitimate daughter of Sebastian González de Mirabal, and that's where the next story begins. I want you to meet a man who stood at the crossroads of bloodline and power. Capitán Sebastian González de Mirabal. His story begins far from Puerto Rico, in Agüimes, Gran Canaria, in the mid-17th century. He was born the son of Capitán Simón Pérez de Mirabal and Doña Luisa Pérez. And even that opening tells you something. Capitán, Doña, rank and standing were in his cradle. Let me place the ancestors so you can feel his pedigree. On Sebastián's paternal side, his father, Simón Pérez de Mirabal, was the son of Francisco Pérez de Mirabal and Isabel de Los Angeles. Go one generation further, Francisco was the son of Lorente Pérez and Maria de Mirabal, and Isabel descended from Juan González Galán and Ana Jiménez. The Mirabal name weaves through the line like a banner. On the maternal side, Sebastián's mother, Doña Luisa Pérez, was the daughter of Juan Álvarez Ortiz, an alcalde ordinario, or a town executive, and Juana Hidalga. Luisa's grandparents extended the civic footing. Paternally, Diego Álvarez and Isabel Ortiz. Maternally, Pedro Sánchez and Maria Hidalga. This is the DNA of local governance. Alcaldes, landholders, people who signed their names in ink and backed it with soldiers. When Sebastián comes to view in Puerto Rico, he marries into power again. Doña Maria Verdugo Montalvo, legitimate daughter of Juan de Segarra, also alcalde ordinario, and Maria de Montalvo, herself the daughter of Capitán Diego de Montalvo and Doña Cecilia de Espinosa. The Mirabal house locks arms with the Segarra Montalvo house. Together, they had a number of children. Now, to the man's career. In the 1680s, Sebastián holds seats in the Cabildo of San Germán, a municipal council with real teeth in the west of the island. He appears as alcalde ordinario in 1683 and 1685, and as regidor in 1684. He also resides in Aguada, part of the western network that fed and policed the coastline. He is both town politician and a militia officer, the two gears that turned Puerto Rico then. In 1689, Sebastián acquires the office of Alférez Mayor of the Villa, chief standard bearer, and senior militia officer for local musters. Think of Alférez as ensign, the lowest commissioned officer in the Spanish colonial system. But Alférez Mayor was the senior of that grade within the town's military hierarchy. He replaces Antonio de Adorno, and a few years later, in 1695, the crown confirms his title. That same year, the documents note he is about 42, a literate man who signs confidently. The governor also names him as Teniente y Capitán a Guerra del Partido de la Aguada, military chief of the district from 1695 to 1701. He's the guy who's supposed to keep the coast quiet at night and the jails secure by day. Real life is messier. In 1690, he's blamed for poor security at the jail and the Cabildo house, and for neglecting night patrols. In 1691, when a small Coast Guard vessel needs funding, Sebastián steps up among the vecinos of Aguada to donate produce, livestock, or cash. He owns cattle herds in the Hato de Culebrinas, so he has resources, obligations, and enemies. By 1699, politics turns poisonous. A secret pesquisa, part of a residencia review of a former governor, produces allegations against Sebastián. An order is issued to imprison him. This is the first big pivot. In the early 1700s, the new governor, Gabriel Gutierrez de la Riva, will accuse Sebastián of more: that he exercised the office of alferez mayor without license, that he was the one who sold achiote to the Dutch, that he was condemned, stripped of office, and sentenced to exile for 6 years with fines. Allegations that swirl with politics and personal vendettas. He is even seized at El Morro, while the ship is being ready to take him away. He posts a bond to go back to Aguada to settle business. But here's the part the documents make crystal clear. The story does not end there. In 1703, Sebastián is in Madrid, living on Calle San Bernardo Angosta, appearing as a witness in a case against ex-governor Antonio Robles y Silva. And in 1704, the sentence against Sebastián is revoked. The record says the charges rested on a condemned man's false sworn confession. The cloud lifts, but the conflict hasn't finished with him. In 1701, between those storms, Sebastián, still alferez mayor, sits on a junta convened by the governor to deal with an alzamiento of vecinos in Ponce. The West is restless. Contraband is a way of life. The central government's demands feel like extraction. That year, the governor levies a blanket fine across San Germán for contraband, and Sebastián is assessed at 100 reales, a symbol of how wide the net was cast. What follows is the episode that will be remembered as the Rebellion of San Germán, 1701 to 1712. Not a peasant riot, but a prolonged municipal resistance led by the cabildos of San Germán and its satellite towns, against what locals saw as abusive orders and forced provisioning for the capital. Sebastian González de Mirabal is in the middle of it, a spokesman, an officer, and a target. The governor escalates. He sends officers and orders seizures. Inventories in the Repartimiento de la Mula of 1711 lists Sebastián's properties: a wooden and thatch house in the pueblo of Aguada, holdings in La Victoria and La Laguna, sites in Rincón and Cabo Rojo, valued and picked clean in the push to break Western resistance. That accounting, cold lines of goods and coin, shows the state's pressure as plainly as any speech. And then comes the flight, the scene I can't stop picturing. In 1709, with the noose tightening, Sebastián and his son-in-law, Jerónimo Ramos Colón, slip from Cabo Rojo in a canoe, aiming for Santo Domingo. The sea is not merciful. They endure endless hardship until they meet a balandra of the Asiento de Negros that share water and food. They reach Santo Domingo, where Sebastián and Jerónimo take refuge at the Convento de San Francisco and file claims, turning flight into a legal counterattack. The governor had ordered the Coast Patrol to block passage to Santo Domingo. Still, they make it. That's not just survival, that's audacity. That escape threads into my own family history. Jerónimo Ramos Colon, the man in that canoe, married Jacinta de Mirabal, Sebastian's daughter, and they are my 8th great-grandparents. Sebastian González de Mirabal and Doña Maria Verdugo Montalvo are my 9th great-grandparents. Through this same branch, David Zayas and I are related. The history I'm telling is literally in both of our veins. Back in Puerto Rico, the conflict grinds on. Sebastian's son, Francisco de Mirabal, a cleric, takes the fight into the courtroom, challenging the governor for injuries done to the family. And the paper trail keeps circling. Sebastian, orders of arrest, releases, property list, and the financial hammer of the 1711 repartimiento. Even after the revocation of 1704, the suspicion lingers. Officials accuse, neighbors whisper, and yet the records also show Sebastian doing what Western elites did: raising cattle, serving office, petitioning. In 1712, he presents a Relación de Méritos, a formal dossier of service, asking for a captaincy of infantry in Santiago de Cuba. Think about that. After being chased, fined, stripped on paper, fleeing by canoe, and resurfacing in a convent, he still complies his merits and applies for another command. That's not resignation. That's a soldier's instinct for rank and restoration. So who was Sebastian González de Mirabal when you pull back? A Canarian-born officer whose bloodlines ran straight through town halls and militia ranks. A San Germán cabildante who bought, then earned confirmation of his alferez mayor post. A district war captain in Aguada, a landholder in Culebrinas, and, when the West rose against the capital's overreach, a face of municipal resistance. Sometimes lionized, often criminalized, never silent. He navigated accusations that were later revoked, rode out political storms that would have broken a lesser man, and, at the peak of danger, he chose the open sea and a canoe rather than bend. His story is not tidy. It isn't meant to be. It's the story of how power actually works in a small colony with a long coastline. Cabildos and governors, militia titles and contraband rumors, fines that turn into property seizures, and families who answer with petitions, allies, and fight when they must. It's a story of how a surname, Mirabal, travels from Agüimes to Aguada, through San Germán, Cabo Rojo, and Santo Domingo, and down the generations into modern Puerto Rican families, including mine and that of David Zayas. When I read the old pages that name Sebastian, Alcalde, Alferez Mayor, Capitán a Guerra, I see the ledger lines of a life spent between duty and defiance. I see a man who could sit in council by day, command the patrol by night, and when the tide turned, trust in a canoe, a current, and a convent to keep his cause alive. This is not a biography, that's a pulse. And from that pulse, the branch grows. To his daughter, Michaela de Mirabal, to her son, José de Quiñones, to his daughter, Clara de Quiñones, to her daughter, Blanca Goytia, to her son, José María Cintrón, to his son, Juan José Cintrón, to his son, Elias Cintrón, to his daughter, Emilia Cintrón, to her daughter, Blanca Rivera, and finally, to David Zayas, actor, veteran, and the descendant of a line that learned to face storms with discipline and heart. I am Dyron Castro Torres, the genealogist, and this is just the beginning.